Okay, good morning. We'll call this meeting to order. We're going to start as a subcommittee of the subcommittee. Right, Mr. Chavez? Okay, this is Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 2 on Education and Finance. Today's hearing is on the Local Control Funding Formula, LCFF. And as we know, this is the third year of the implementation of the LCFF, which is a fundamental change to how we fund our public schools here in Sacramento, focusing on the most disadvantaged communities and schools, our English language learners, low-income students, and our foster youth. And we know it's a work in progress, and also a part of that is the local control accountability plans, which is focused on making sure the monies are spent appropriately and also holding schools accountable. Part of this hearing is to focus on how it's going so far in the third year and make sure we're on the right path going forward. We have panels from local and state leaders talking about the implementation of LCFF and their LCAP process. So I want to thank the local superintendents for joining us here this morning. We'll hear you in a few moments. And as we know, the focus also is what's in the governor's budget to implement year 3 of LCFF. We know after 2 solid years of funding LCFF, we are now in our third year, and we're at about 95% of where we should be, and roughly a little over half where we will be at the end of the day funding LCFF. This year's budget has the budget year will have $2.8 billion in new funds to further implement LCFF, help us along the way. And also in this hearing, we'll be hearing from the Department of Education on the impact of the new federal Every Student Succeeds Act, which has replaced, as we know, the outdated No Child Left Behind. So with that, I look forward to today's conversation, and we will begin. Any opening comments, Mr. Chavez?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, no. So panel number 1, we have the LAO, Department of Education, the Board of Ed, and the California Collaboration for Educational Excellence. Okay, let's start with Edgar Cabral, LAO.
Good morning. Members, Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. We were asked to provide a brief overview of the LCFF and some of the major recommendations. We have a handout being passed out to you right now that I'll use to cover the basis of the of LCFF and some of those accountability components. I'll go through the LCFF formula for districts and charters, touch on the County Office of Education formula, and then go into the LCAPs and evaluation rubrics. So first on page 1, we have the LCFF for school districts and charter schools. So the LCFF, when it was enacted in 2013, replaced the old system, which provided funding, general purpose funding for revenue limits, and then about 40 categorical programs that were for funding for very specific purposes, and collapsed them into this one formula. The formula has 3 components, and you can see on this chart on the bottom of page 1, we walk through the components of that formula. The first piece is a base rate, which is funding for all students. And as you can see on the chart, the specific base rate varies based on the grade. And in general, the higher the grade, the higher the per student funding. There's also supplemental funding, which is 20% of the base rate. And that's for every student that's an English learner or a low-income student or foster youth. And then finally, there's a third piece, which is called the concentration funding, which is 50% of the base rate, and that's additional funding that districts, county offices, charter schools receive if they have proportions of their student population above 55% that are English learners, low income, or foster youth. On page 2, we walk through a little of the implementation of LCFF. And so when we enacted LCFF in 2013, the LCFF target was significantly higher than the actual 12-13 funding levels. I think at that time, the base rates were about $500 per student above what the old revenue limit rates. And the supplemental and concentration was substantially higher than the amount of categorical funding the state had been providing. And so overall, the estimate was that the LCFF was about $18 billion above that 12-13 spending level. So a substantial amount higher than what the state had been providing. The state has been phasing in the implementation of LCFF as additional funding has been available, and there has been substantial progress. We're at the point where $12.8 billion. There have been $12.8 billion in additional K-12 funding for LCFF implementation. So you can see a chart on the next page that walks through the implementation and how much progress the state has made. So you can see in 13-14 we had it was about 3/4 of the LCFF was funded, and then by the time we're in 16-17 under the governor's proposal, and the proposals for an additional $2.8 billion, we're now 95% of the way. On page 4, we walk through the county office formula briefly. This formula is a two-piece formula. There's one portion is called the operations grant, and that amount is for the basic operations of the county office and for the support that the county office provides to districts in the county. And so the chart on the bottom of the page walks through some of those details, but there's a base level of funding that all counties get, and there's additional funding that's based on the number of school districts that are in the county and the number of students who are enrolled in the county. The other piece, the alternative education portion of it, this is more like the LCFF for districts and charters, which is funding that county offices receive for the students that they serve in their programs. And because the students that are served in the county office programs, there are 4 categories of students that county offices serve. They're either students who are in the juvenile justice system, who have been referred to by probation, they're on probation, or they've been expelled from their school district. Because those students have higher needs, the per student base funding is higher than it is for school districts and charters. Similar to the LCFF for school districts and charters, there's a supplemental and concentration amount as well. Moving on to page 5, we just talking through some of the requirements in terms of spending requirements for LCFF funding. LCFF is substantially more flexible than some of the funding, categorical funding that was provided in prior years. There are some general requirements in the law that have been sort of further, there's been further detailed by the state board regulations, but statute requires districts, county offices, and charters to increase or improve services for English learners, low-income foster youth, in proportion to the increases in funding. The statute also says that some of those increases can be used for countywide, school-wide, or district-wide purposes if those activities are going to benefit the specific targeted students. And the law itself doesn't have a lot of detail, but it specifies that the State Board of Education is to develop regulations, and those regulations have been adopted. The board regulations have a step-by-step process for districts to calculate the amount of funding that they're supposed to increase or improve in a specific year. And then districts, counties, charters are supposed to include that number in their strategic plan, their local control and accountability plan. And then in that plan also, they must describe how they plan on spending the money. And if any of the funds are going to be used for countywide, school-wide, district-wide purposes, they're expected to describe what they're doing with those funds and why a school-wide, district-wide, county-wide approach is appropriate in this case and how it will benefit those students. So that's the basic structure of the funding formula and the requirements, the spending requirements associated with the formula. And then moving to a few of the accountability pieces, these are things that were adopted as part of the legislation for LCFF. And the first thing I think I talk about is on page 6 are the 8 state priority areas. So the state created essentially a state accountability system that had 2 main components, the LCAPs and the evaluation rubrics. And both of them use the 8 state priority areas as the basis. So you can see on page 6 we have the 8 priority areas for districts and the specific metrics that are set in statute that are associated with those priority areas. There are 2 additional priorities that are on the bottom right that are highlighted in gray, and those are priorities that apply to county offices of education in their role as a coordinating body for expelled students and for foster youth. But so the state, in setting this in law, is saying these are the areas that the state thinks are important and thinks that there should be focus on schools improving in these specific areas. Then moving on to page 7, so there are two places where these priority areas manifest. First is in local control and accountability plans, or LCAPs. Districts, county offices, and charters, they all have to adopt an LCAP every year. And in that LCAP, they're required to set goals and specify actions that they're going to take to improve outcomes in the 8 state priority areas. And so for each of these goals, they are required to include metrics that they're going to use to track progress over time. And the intent is that those are aligned with the metrics that were in the previous chart related to those priority areas, although they can also include other outcomes that they want to track. For districts and county offices, because they are locally elected boards, they are required to seek feedback from employees, students, parents, and they're also required to have hearings on LCAPs. So they have to have a hearing where they present a draft and they receive public comment, and then they have to formally adopt their LCAP in a separate board meeting. For charter schools, they are not required to have the same sort of public approval because they don't have a locally elected board. The second piece is the evaluation rubrics, and so the LCAP serves sort of as a planning tool to say these are the priority areas, here's how we plan to improve in those areas. The rubrics are intended to be a way to assess progress and to assess how districts, county offices, charters are doing in improving outcomes in these priority areas. The board is currently working on the rubrics, and they're required to be adopted by October 2016. But statute requires that these rubrics set state-level expectations for performance and improvement in each of the priority areas. And the idea here is that districts, for example, could use those rubrics to look at how they're doing in the various areas and determine where are the areas that they might need to focus to improve outcomes. So this is all still in this piece. The evaluation rubrics is still in progress, but I think the idea here is that we've had a change in the formula that provides more flexibility to school districts, charters, county offices, but that we do have some additional pieces that, one, that there is some transparency and accountability regarding how funds are spent, and there is some more information on plans for how districts will improve outcomes, and that these rubrics will serve as a tool to kind of a feedback loop to have some sense of how districts are doing and where areas there might need to be improvement. So that's everything that we had here, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll wait until we have the panel complete and we'll come back. Thank you. Department of Education.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Deborah Brown on behalf of State Superintendent Tom Thorlickson and the California Department of Education. I'd just like to open to say that we still strongly believe in the goals and objectives of LCFF, which is really around having decision-making and priorities established at the local level rather than the state level, and really focusing support and services on our highest needs students. We're also the department working to really integrate the work that we do so that it does provide, has a more holistic look at what's happening with the LCAP. So we have a local assistance office that is really bringing in different departments. It's really trying to work to be a good support for districts. But building upon what Mr. Cabral said around the LCAPs, we really do see those as the most complete picture of how districts are using their base dollars as well as their supplemental and concentration dollars. Additionally, we'd add that this year was the first year that districts annually were including their updates. So since it was the second year of the LCAP adoption, districts were also required to look at and provide an update on how they did in the first year. And so moving forward, we think that will help provide a more comprehensive picture. Though we do understand that in many cases the LCAPs have become rather quite large in tens of hundreds of pages that often make it difficult for most parents and most community members to look through and find how that information is. However, we do think that is still the best means to get that holistic picture so that you don't have numbers that are out of context with how those dollars are being used and what supports and services they're providing to students. So recognizing this is also as the board is moving towards the adoption of the evaluation rubric, the Department of Education and the State Board are going to be working on an LCAP template update to sort of address some of these concerns that we've heard, as well as to try to make sure that it's aligned with where we're at with the conversation on the evaluation rubric. And so as part of that process, we're really going to have multiple opportunities to have open as well as structured responses for stakeholders, because we do want to have it be a document that is useful and reflects the needs of not only LEAs, but also parents and communities. And I think Mr. Sapp will talk more about that effort later. And so it's in this template and in this template update that we think that's the most important way to address transparency, because it does link the information about resource allocation with how those dollars are being spent. Because separated, they don't provide you that context. What's important is what those dollars are being used for and how they're actually supporting students, as well as we'll talk, I think later on, as we're redefining the accountability system. So we're also going to begin to really focus in real and meaningful ways on a more holistic approach to accountability. And so all of this is happening at the same time, and so it makes it difficult, but it also makes it an excellent opportunity to align all of these systems and really move away from a system that was more focused on punishment rather than support and continuous improvement, and also create a line system that also doesn't create confusion for parents at the local level, where you're in program improvement but doing well on the API. Those weren't that system wasn't supportive, and again, it was focused on punishment rather than really looking at continuous improvement and also support and capacity building for districts. And I think that's where the role of the collaborative will come in as well. So importantly, this system is moving away from focusing on the negative consequences and really building towards that system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. State Board of Education.
Good morning, David Sapp on behalf of the State Board. I'm on staff at the State Board. It's very nice to be here to give you an update on the ongoing work that the board is in the midst of implementing LCFF, and in particular pieces that were delegated to the board to develop. Mr. Cabral's overview is extremely helpful in providing the context. I'm actually going to summarize that context in actually a little bit of a temporal form, which is in the way that LCFF was enacted, it was set up in 3 phases of implementation. At the beginning, in enacting LCFF in 2013, the legislature was moving away from an input-based system of accountability to one that focuses on outcomes of students, and in particular, looking at whether the investment for the high-needs students is improving outcomes for them in particular. The statutes, as I said, have 3 distinct phases. The first is upon enactment, there was a major overhaul of the school finance system. We dramatically simplified the state mechanism for providing funding, and the new formula reflects that students with greater need require additional resources. And as a part of that process, the legislature consolidated more than 40 categoricals into this new simplified funding formula. The sum total of that is that by reducing the amount of money we're spending tracking how dollars are being spent, we're able to invest in programs and services for students at the classroom level, and in particular, increasing and improving services for the high-needs student groups. And this really embodies LCFF's focus on outcomes, whether the services and programs supporting by the funding are actually moving the dial for kids. Second, the legislature delegated to the State Board the task of developing the template for the local plans and annual update, as well as the expenditure regulations about the use of the supplemental and concentration funding for the additional dollars for the high-needs student groups. The State Board adopted those regulations in early 2014 and has already updated the LCAP and annual update template once since then as a part of the regulatory process. The LCAP, as Mr. Cabral said, focuses on the 8 state priorities. There are more than 22 metrics identified in statute across those priorities, and the LCAP is really intended to help support the transition to focusing on outcomes. Part of it is supposed to look at the needs assessment, setting goals across those state priorities, and then identifying the actions, services, and investments to support those services to move that programming forward. It also requires engagement with stakeholders in a level that wasn't required in the prior system. So the conversation locally is informed by engaging the different stakeholder groups that are deeply affected. Mr. Cabral covered the expenditure regulations, but one thing that I think is important to emphasize is that those regulations require LEAs in their LCAPs to talk about how they are using the additional dollars generated for the high-needs students to increase or improve services for those students relative to the increased funding. What this means is that there's a section in the LCAP template where districts are required to make the case for why there was an increase or improvement. And on top of that, for any use of those funds for school-wide or district-wide purposes, which were authorized by statute, the LEA is required to explain why that investment is actually advancing the goals for the high-needs students who generate the funding. So that, again, that's a part of the LCAP, and it requires the stakeholder engagement process to have a conversation about those priorities locally. And as a result of that, as Ms. Brown alluded to, trying to analyze sort of what those services are, the increased or improved services outside the context of the LCAP is going to miss some really important context, because not only is it a quantitative conversation, it's about increasing or improving. And so in looking at what the improvement is, that's also a qualitative context-based discussion, and that's why that conversation is supposed to take place in the LCAP process itself. What we've seen in the process is that there is increased evidence of stakeholder engagement about the way that districts are thinking about the planning process, greater collaboration between the fiscal and instructional side of LEAs, and basically a broader focus on what it means to have success in school, the 8 state priorities, as opposed to just focusing narrowly on test scores. There are also several challenges that Ms. Brown alluded to, where the LCAP process isn't working the way I think that all of us expected that it might, and also where the implementation is a little uneven. We have a large state with very different local contexts. So some general themes have emerged. I'll just touch on 4 of them. The first is that LCAPs are too complex. They're way too long. Some of them are 400 or more pages. It makes it really hard for the stakeholder and transparency to take place if it's that complex of a document. Second, there's a great deal of inconsistency about how much of the overall budget of the LEA is being addressed within the LCAP, sometimes ranging from just supplemental concentration all the way up to the majority of the budget. So again, there's some different approaches across the state that make it difficult to sort of compare statewide. Third, there's a general lack of connection between the instructional planning and the budgeting process. Again, there's some inconsistency there. There's some places where we're seeing really dramatic progress and thinking about why we're investing in the programs and services, others where the LCAP isn't necessarily connected to the budget priorities. And finally, the section of the LCAP that I described earlier about the increased or improved services, we're seeing some inconsistency there about whether it's providing clear and consistent information about how the services are being increased or improved, and also particularly around the school-wide, district-wide uses of this funding, of this funds, the level of detail included. As Ms. Brown alluded to, we're in the plan to move forward and bring to the board proposed template revisions. We're expecting local education agencies to engage in a process of continuous improvement, and we believe there's a role for the state to model that. And this is an example of learning from what's working, what isn't, and to engage in a deep stakeholder process over a series of months before the board moves forward with changes to try to make this process work better. Finally, we're in the midst of the 3rd phase. The legislature created the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, also delegated to the state board the project, which is quite large, of adopting evaluation rubrics. Together, those are key components of the system of assistance, support, and intervention that LCFF created. So the board's now focusing on the LCFF evaluation rubrics by October 2016, and those will help LEAs identify their strengths, weaknesses, and areas of improvement, really focusing again on outcomes and different indicators across the state priorities. The County Office of Education, the department, and the newly established CCEE are going to be available to provide technical assistance, support, and ultimately intervention as required by the statutes. And the enactment of ESSA, the Federal Every Student Succeeds Act, in December provides us unique opportunities as a state to really align our systems. So in the midst of doing the evaluation rubrics work, we now have an opportunity to align those indicators with what we're doing at the state level. So briefly, where's the state board in the development of the LCFF evaluation rubrics? The board's meeting on Thursday to talk about the evaluation rubrics. This item has been agendized for Thursday morning. Staff have included a recommendation in that agenda item for the board to direct staff along with the department to develop a full rubrics prototype based on a couple of key design features that have been laid out in a series of information memos that were posted over the last month or so. Within the statutory structure, the rubrics are intended to help LEAs assess their progress and outcomes across the 8 state priorities. The way that that's being done in the current prototype is to present information for indicators and in particular quantitative measures that are available at the state level about how LEAs are doing in terms of their outcomes as well as their improvement over time for all students, for the student subgroups that are statistically significant and all down to the school site level, and then also to show how that outcome and the progress over time compares to what's happening at the state level. So essentially it includes a component of displaying outcome information on the metrics that are included within the LCFF statutes for which we have state level data available. This again is intended to really focus on this final stage of LCFF implementation, which is looking at outcomes for students across the priority areas. I'm happy to answer any questions about specifics about the information memos that we've posted, but really I think 3 key points that the board, we have asked the board to address on Thursday. The first is the overall architecture. And this includes a memo that sort of lays out how do all these pieces fit together. We have the LCAP, which is supposed to, the local plan, which is supposed to address all 8 state priority areas. That's the foundation of our local system, our local control funding formula, the accountability at the local level. We now have this new tool that's coming online, the evaluation rubrics. So the architecture proposes how the rubrics will support that local process by focusing on outcomes and providing analysis for LEAs. In particular, a lot of LEAs are so small they don't have full-time data teams. So this is a role for the state in developing the tool to really try to provide help and fill that capacity to help support reflection and improvement over time. And then at the same time, the rubrics will include a concise set of those indicators for which we have state information that will be used in the state and federal support and assistance system. So the idea is that for those indicators across the priorities, to pull those out and display the information so that we can see how the outcomes look across the state across the statewide perspective. This state board and staff have had hundreds of meetings with stakeholders, considerable input from researchers, practitioners through this process. We anticipate continuing that all the way through the final adoption of the rubrics. Just to summarize, the evaluation rubrics are a tool within the LCFF structure that will help show for educators, local stakeholders, and state policymakers whether the investments that were made locally are paying off in terms of improving outcomes for students. Again, as we've transitioned from an input base to an outcome base, this is the final piece that will really help provide that outcome perspective. This also includes the choices made locally about how the additional dollars generated by the high need students are being invested, because we're going to be able to display and show what those outcomes look like for student subgroups, including those 3 high needs subgroups that generate the additional funding. But finally, we also hear some of the concern at the state policymakers about not necessarily having the clearest role as we've transitioned from this input-based system where we're focused on tracking dollars to this new outcome-based system. The reason why I provided this sort of 3 phases of implementation context is that to just show that we knew at the front end in implementing LCFF that there was going to be a transition period. That it was designed from the very beginning that we would change the funding structure, then develop the local planning process, and then several years later we'd have the rubrics and the outcome-based focus. And so in the course of that transition, we're not tracking every single dollar as the way we used to in the Sacramento-based system of accountability, and it can feel like there's a little bit of a vacuum. But we're to the point where we are going to have that final piece, that final tool in place that's going to help us see those outcomes for certain indicators that are available at the state level and compare and see whether progress is being made and those investments are paying off. So just want to close by saying that we know that there's a need to continue to improve the tools that we have. We expect that even the rubrics tool, when it's adopted, we're going to have to make some adjustments and improvements over time with that as well. But we think we are on the right track in terms of focusing on a system that's really looking at, are the decisions made locally driving better outcomes for the kids who are supposed to be served by our system?
Thank you. Next.